I'm joined today by Michael Watson, who is CEO of the vaccine startup MEVOX, has had a 25 plus year career in vaccines, working at Moderna, Sanofi Pasteur, is currently, full disclosure, an advisor to Greenlight. And I'd love to hear, Michael, a little bit about what we were discussing just now on your experience with vaccines and vaccine supplies and that vaccine ecosystem. It's a very niche medical area in some ways, absolutely essential for global health, but sometimes the economics are very challenging.
Yeah, vaccines are very interesting because on the one hand, it's a commodity. We want to make huge amounts available to everybody. On the other hand, it's strategic, it's security. You know, you don't necessarily contract out your bullet manufacturer to another country. So you want to make sure that you can make this important thing. And the third thing is, unlike most commodities, it relies on innovation. So to keep a healthy ecosystem, you need to make sure that you're ticking all of those boxes. And that's not something that's easy to do and not something everybody thinks about doing.
Have you in your career faced challenges where economics have come in raised a challenge to innovation?
I have, and that's really what started me thinking so hard about the ecosystem. I found myself at a previous large company having to stop the production of a globally important vaccine because refitting the facility required cost. We couldn't recoup that cost in increased prices. And that left the world with a single manufacturer for that vaccine. That single manufacturer is very good, but you don't want to rely again for a strategic product on one producer.
So you've reduced, basically, you've gone from a situation where multiple producers of something the world needs down to one. If there's a fire in that vaccine facility, what happens?
Exactly. You're done. You're stuffed. And that's the problem. It's if you just race to the bottom on price and volumes, sooner or later quality and innovation suffer. You can think of it as a triangle. It's a triangle of innovation, of supply reliability, and of quality and innovation.
Okay. Does this mean that there is no way forward? Capitalism is evil. There's no way forward. How can we resolve this problem?
Yeah, quite the opposite. I mean, capitalism is an amazing machine because the ecosystem is so complicated. And like all ecosystems, if you try and meddle with individual bits of those ecosystems, it usually goes wrong. The Australians will tell you many stories about where they've tried to do that. And so the best way of making an ecosystem work is to have the right pushes and pulls in place, have the right incentives. And that's where capitalism works fantastically. So we need to get the incentives right. And we also need to get the leadership and the vision right.
Okay. And one of the things in terms of how you balance this ecosystem, you've done a lot of thinking and work in relation to low-income countries, low to middle-income countries, and how they need to balance supply, production. What is your vision about how that ecosystem has to work so that we can vaccinate the world? And with COVID-19, unless we do vaccinate the world, we're going to be stuck in this perpetual cycle of variants that mean we're living with COVID for the rest of our lives. So how do we vaccinate the world, I guess is my question.
Yeah, I mean, today we have very much a philosophy of vaccination, which is about making fish and giving it to people to eat. You know, what we should think more about is how we teach people to fish so that they can supply themselves, so they can innovate themselves, so we have devolved production. So when the next pandemic comes, and it will, and we've had pandemic threats every 2 to 5 years for the last decades, when it comes, we'll have devolved production that can react. And if you have 100 units reacting, life is much easier to manage than if you've only got 4 or 5 global units reacting.
And what does that look from the point of view of a low-income country versus a middle-income country?
I think, well, low-income countries will take a while, but it's hopefully the beginning of an innovation culture. If we take RNA as an example, RNA is much closer to engineering than previous vaccines, which were much more about of art and know-how and very subtle differences in how you do things. So I think the ability to establish production for RNA in lower income settings, lower resource settings where there's lower levels of expertise, I think is higher. And I think that once you start to do that, you create a virtuous spiral and you create more know-how, more expectation, more investment, and ultimately, hopefully, establish a devolved vaccine production and then innovation around the world.
So why is RNA particularly suited to that? mRNA particularly suited to that?
mRNA is suited because I think of it as what I call linear learning. Everything you learn from one mRNA vaccine, you've learnt for the next one. You don't have to relearn it. So you're essentially putting square Lego bricks on top of each other, and the tower's getting higher all the time. Old vaccines were a bit like balancing fruit. You can do it. You can balance an apple and a pear and an orange and a satsuma. But you have to be pretty skilled, you have to be pretty patient, and when you come down in the morning, you'll find that the tower will have fallen over because something has changed and you'll have to do it again. So RNA is very much easier to manage.
And what are the elements that make that easier? I mean,
as I say, it's because it's essentially engineering approach, and it's the same approach for every vaccine. You've got your plasmid. You make a plasmid, the DNA that codes for the RNA. You make the RNA. You package it in the same packaging. Because of that, the toxicity studies are minimal or not required. You go into a study, what you'll find is the safety is pretty much the same. If you decide then you want vaccine A to be combined with vaccine B because they're both made in the same way, that's pretty straightforward to do. Whereas in the past, trying to combine a live attenuated vaccine with an activated vaccine with a conjugated vaccine was very difficult simply because they're chemically incompatible.
Okay. And but the complexity of producing this, could we put where could we put a factory like this or a production facility like this? Would this be able to go into, would this have to be in a Boston or a Cambridge or a Singapore, or is this something that you could go into another lower income country?
I think today one could put this anywhere where one could put a biologics production facility. So that's certainly from middle income countries up. That would be relatively straightforward to do. However, as we think forward, because this is engineering, because there's a real digital element to that, you can imagine a day in 10 or 20 years' time when actually you can have essentially RNA printers around the world. And so you can imagine that you can progressively place RNA production in lower and lower resource settings until you're really right down into a devolved low resource setting.
Which then overcomes one of the challenges you've highlighted a lot in terms of the current generation of RNA vaccines, mRNA vaccines, which is the stability, both for temperature and general resilience of the product.
Absolutely. Yeah, that would address that. And you also, you can think of a case in the future where when the pandemic comes, all you need to do is to send the code around the world and the printers are ready. The software updates as you do with any computer, and they're ready to print off the new vaccine the next morning.
So in the battle virus versus humans, where do you think we are right now?
The viruses have always won. Viruses have been around much longer than us. But we're doing pretty well because we're using RNA essentially learns from viruses. We're doing exactly what a virus does. A virus, is this little globule that gets into your body and injects its RNA into your cell to make copies of itself. Well, we're making little globules, guess what, that we put into the cell. They use the cell to make copies of itself. It's just that the itself that it's making is a vaccine rather than a virus. So at last, we're learning from the viruses.
Okay, so we're taking a more viral approach to viruses, which is the right way forward.
Exactly.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.